Chapter 11 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 11. One of the damnedest in our whole Saturnalia of the accursed. Because it is hopeless to try to shake off an excommunication only by saying that we're damned by blacker things than ourselves, and that the damned are those who admit they're of the damned. Inertia and hypnosis are too strong for us. We say that, then we go right on, admitting we're of the damned. It is only by being more nearly real that we can sweep away the quasi-things that oppose us. Of course, as a whole, we have considerable amorphousness, but we are thinking now of individual acceptances. Wideness is an aspect of universalness or realness. If our syntheses disregard fewer data than do opposing syntheses, which are often not syntheses at all, but mere consideration of some one circumstance, less widely synthetic things fade away before us. Harmony is an aspect of the universal, by which we mean realness. If we approximate more highly to harmony among the parts of an expression and to all available circumstances of an occurrence, the self-contradictors turn hazy. Solidity is an aspect of realness. We pile them up and we pile them up, or they pass and pass and pass. Things that bulk large as they march by, supporting and solidifying one another. And still, and for regiments to come, hypnosis and inertia rule us. One of the damnedest of our data. In the Scientific American, September 10, 1910, Charles F. Holder writes: "Many years ago, a strange stone resembling a meteorite fell into the valley of the Yaqui, Mexico, and the sensational story went from one end to the other of the country that a stone bearing human inscriptions had descended to the earth." The bewildering observation here is Mr. Holder's assertion that this stone did fall. It seems to me that he must mean that it fell by dislodgment from a mountainside into a valley, but we shall see that it was such a marked stone that very unlikely would it have been unknown to dwellers in a valley if it had been reposing upon a mountainside above them. It may have been carelessness. Intent may have been to say that a sensational story of a strange stone said to have fallen, etc. The stone was reported by Major Frederick Burnham, of the British Army. Later Major Burnham revisited it, and Mr. Holder accompanied him, their purpose to decipher the inscriptions upon it, if possible. The stone was brown, igneous rock, its longest axis about 8 feet, and on the eastern face, which had an angle of about 45 degrees, was the deep-cut inscription. Mr. Holder says that he recognized familiar Mayan symbols in the inscription. His method was the usual method by which anything can be identified as anything else. That is, to pick out whatever is agreeable and disregard the rest. He says that he has demonstrated that most of the symbols are Mayan. One of our intermediatist pseudo-principles is that any way of demonstrating anything is just as good a way of demonstrating anything else. By Mr. Holder's method, we could demonstrate that we're Mayan, if that should be a source of pride to us. One of the characters upon the stone is a circle within a circle. Similar character found by Mr. Holder is a Mayan manuscript. There are 2 sixes. Sixes can be found in Mayan manuscripts. A double scroll. There are dots, and there are dashes. Well, then we, in turn, disregard the circle within a circle and the double scroll, and emphasize that sixes occur in this book, and that dots are plentiful, and would be more plentiful if it were customary to use the small I for the first personal pronoun, and that when it comes to dashes That's demonstrated. We're Mayan. I suppose the tendency is to feel that we're sneering at some valuable archaeologic work, and that Mr. Holder did make a veritable identification. He writes, "I submitted the photographs to the Field Museum and the Smithsonian, and one or two others, and to my surprise, the reply was that they could make nothing out of it." Our indefinite acceptance, by preponderance of 3 or 4 groups of museum experts against one person, is that a stone bearing inscriptions unassimilable with any known language upon this earth is said to have fallen from the sky. Another poor wretch of an outcast belonging here is noted in the Scientific American 48-261. That of an object, or a meteorite, that fell February 16, 1883, near Brescia, Italy, a false report was circulated that one of the fragments bore the impress of a hand. That's all that is findable by me upon this mere gasp of a thing. Intermediatistically, my acceptance is that, though in the course of human society there have been some notable approximations, there never has been a real liar. That he could not survive in intermediateness, where everything merges away, or has its pseudo-base in something else, will be instantly translated to the negative absolute. So my acceptance is that, though curtly dismissed, there was something to base upon in this report, that there was unusual markings upon this object. Of course, that is not to jump to the conclusion that they were cuneiform characters that looked like fingerprints. Altogether, I think that in some of our past expressions we must have been very efficient, if the experience of Mr. Symons be typical, so indefinite are we becoming here. Just here we're interested in many things that have been found, especially in the United States, which speak of a civilization, or of many civilizations not indigenous to this earth. One trouble is in trying to decide whether they fell here from the sky, or were left behind by visitors from other worlds. We have a notion that there have been disasters aloft, and that coins have dropped here, that inhabitants of this earth found them or saw them fall, and then made coins imitatively. It may be that coins were showered here by something of a tutelary nature that undertook to advance us from the stage of barter to the use of a medium. If coins should be identified as Roman coins, we've had so much experience with identifications that we know a phantom when we see one. But even so, how could Roman coins have got to North America, far in the interior of North America, or buried under the accumulations of centuries of soil, unless they did drop from whatever the first Romans came from? Ignatius Donnelly, in Atlantis, gives a list of objects that have been found in mounds that are supposed to antedate all European influence in America. Lath-made articles, such as traders, from somewhere, would supply to savages, marks of the lathe said to be unmistakable. Said to be, of course we can't accept that anything is unmistakable. In the report of the Smithsonian Institute, 1881-619, there is an account, by Charles C. Jones, of 2 silver crosses that were found in Georgia. They are skillfully made, highly ornamented crosses, but are not conventional crucifixes, all arms of equal length. Mr. Jones is a good positivist. That De Soto had halted at the precise spot where these crosses were found, but the spirit of negativeness that lurks in all things said to be precise shows itself in that upon one of these crosses is an inscription that has no meaning in Spanish or any other known terrestrial language, Yinkisidu, according to Mr. Jones. He thinks that this is a name, and that there is an aboriginal ring to it, though I should say, myself, that he was thinking of the far distant Incas, that the Spanish donor cut on the cross the name of an Indian to whom it was presented. but we look at the inscription ourselves and see that the letters said to be C and D are turned the wrong way, and that the letter to be K is not only turned the wrong way, but is upside down. It is difficult to accept that the remarkable, the very extensive copper mines in the region of Lake Superior were ever the works of American aborigines. Despite the astonishing extent of these mines, nothing has ever been found to indicate that the region was ever inhabited by permanent dwellers. "Not a vestige of a dwelling, a skeleton, or a bone has been found." The Indians have no traditions relating to the mines. American Antiquarian 25-258. I think that we've had visitors. That they have come here for copper, for instance. As to other relics of them. But we now come upon frequency of a merger that has not so often appeared before. Fraudulency. Hair called real hair. Then there are wigs. Teeth called real teeth. Then there are false teeth. Official money, counterfeit money. It's the bane of psychic research. If there be psychic phenomena, there must be fraudulent psychic phenomena. So desperate is the situation here that Carrington argues that even if Palladino be caught cheating, that is not to say that all her phenomena are fraudulent. My own version is that nothing indicates anything in a positive sense, because in a positive sense there is nothing to be indicated. Everything that is called true must merge away indistinguishably into something called false. Both are expressions of the same underlying quasiness, and are continuous. Fraudulent antiquarian relics are very common, but they are not more common than are fraudulent paintings. W.S. Forrest, Historical Sketches of Norfolk, Virginia. That in September 1833, when some workmen near Norfolk were boring for water, a coin was drawn up from a depth of about 30 feet. It was about the size of an English shilling, but oval, an oval disc, if not a coin. The figures upon it were distinct, and represented "a warrior or hunter, and other characters apparently of Roman origin." The means of execution would probably be men digging a hole, no one else looking. One of them drops a coin into the hole. As to where he got a strange coin, remarkable in shape even, that's disregarded. Up comes the coin. Expressions of astonishment from the evil one who had dropped it. However, the antiquarians have missed this coin. I can find no other mention of it. Another coin, also a little study in the genesis of a prophet. In the American Antiquarian 16-313 is copied a story by a correspondent to the Detroit News of a copper coin about the size of a 2-cent piece, said to have been found in a Michigan mound. The editor says merely that he does not endorse the find. Upon this slender basis he buds out, in the next number of the Antiquarian, "The coin turns out, as we predicted, to be a fraud." You can imagine the scorn of Elijah, or any one of the old, more nearly real prophets. Or all things are tried by the one kind of jurisprudence we have in quasi-existence: presumed to be innocent until convicted. But they're guilty. The editor's reasoning is as phantom-like as my own, or St. Paul's, or Darwin's. The coin is condemned because it came from the same region from which, a few years before, had come pottery that had been called fraudulent. The pottery had been condemned because it was condemnable. Scientific American, June 17, 1882. That a farmer in Cass County, Illinois, had picked up, on his farm, a bronze coin which was sent to Professor F.F. Hilder of St. Louis, who identified it as a coin of Antiochus IV. Inscription said to be in ancient Greek characters. Translated, as King Antiochus Epiphanes, Illustrious, the Victorious. Sounds quite definite and convincing. But we have some more translations coming. In the American Pioneer 2-169 are shown two faces of a copper coin, with characters very much like those upon the Grave Creek stone, which, with translations, we'll take up soon. This coin is said to have been found in Connecticut in 1843. Records of the past 12-182 that early in 1913 a coin, said to be a Roman coin, was reported as discovered in an Illinois mound. It was sent to Mr. Emerson, of the Art Institute of Chicago. His opinion was that the coin is, quote, of the rare mintage of Domitius Domitianus, Emperor in Egypt, end quote. As to its discovery in an Illinois mound, Dr. Emerson disclaims responsibility. But what strikes me here is that a joker should not have been satisfied with an ordinary Roman coin. Where did he get a rare coin, and why was it not missed from some collection? I have looked over numismatic journals enough to accept that the whereabouts of every rare coin in anyone's possession is known to coin collectors. Seems to me nothing left but to call this another identification. Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society 12-224 that in July 1871 a letter was received from Mr. Jacob W. Muffet of Chillicothe, Illinois, enclosing a photograph of a coin which he said had been brought up by him while boring from a depth of 120 feet. Of course, by conventional scientific standards, such depth has some extraordinary meaning. Paleontologists, geologists, and archaeologists consider themselves reasonable in arguing ancient origin of the far buried. We only accept. Depth is a pseudo-standard with us. One earthquake could bury a coin of recent mintage 120 feet below the surface. According to a writer in the Proceedings, the coin is uniform in thickness, and had never been hammered out by savages. Quote, "There are other tokens of the machine shop." End quote. But, according to Professor Leslie, it is an astrologic amulet. Quote, "There are upon it the signs of Pisces and Leo." End quote. Or, with due disregard, you can find signs of your great-grandmother, or of the Crusades, or of the Mayans, upon anything that ever came from Chillicothe, or from a 5 and 10 cent store. Anything that looks like a cat and a goldfish looks like Leo and Pisces, but, by due suppression and distortions, there's nothing that can't be made to look like a cat and a goldfish. I fear me we're turning a little irritable here. To be damned by slumbering giants and interesting little harlots and clowns who rank high in their profession is at least supportable to our vanity. But we find that the anthropologists are of the slums of the divine, or of an archaic kindergarten of intellectuality, and it is very unflattering to find a mess of mouldy infants sitting in judgment upon us. Professor Leslie then finds, as arbitrarily as one might find that some joker put the Brooklyn Bridge where it is, that, quote, "the piece was placed there as a practical joke, though not by its present owner, and is a modern fabrication, perhaps of the 16th century, possibly Hispano-American or French-American origin." End quote. It's sheer, brutal attempt to assimilate a thing that may or may not have fallen from the sky with phenomena admitted by the anthropologic system, or with the early French or Spanish explorers of Illinois. Though it is ridiculous in a positive sense to give reasons, it is more acceptable to attempt reasons more nearly real than opposing reasons. Of course, in his favor, we note that Professor Leslie qualifies his notions. But his disregards are that there is nothing either French or Spanish about the coin. A legend upon it is said to be, quote, "somewhere between Arabic, and Phoenician, without being either." Professor Winchell, Sparks from a Geologist's Hammer, page 170, says of the crude designs upon this coin, which was in his possession, scrawls of an animal and of a warrior, or of a cat and a goldfish, whichever be convenient, that they had been neither stamped nor engraved, but "looked as if etched with an acid." That is a method unknown in numismatics of this earth. As to the crudity of the design upon this coin, and something else, that though the warrior may be, by due disregard, either a cat or a goldfish, we have to note that his headdress is typical of the American Indian. Could be explained, of course, but for fear that we might be instantly translated to the positive absolute, which may not be absolutely desirable, we prefer to have some flaws or negativeness in our own expressions. Data of more than the thrice accursed. Tablets of stone, with the 10 Commandments engraved upon them in Hebrew, said to have been found in the mounds of the United States. Masonic emblems said to have been found in the mounds in the United States. Were upon the borderline of our acceptances, and were amorphous in the uncertainties and mergings of our outline. Conventionally, or with no real reason for doing so, we exclude these things, and then, as grossly and arbitrarily and irrationally, though our attempt is always to approximate away from these negative states, as ever a Kepler, Newton, or Darwin made his selections, without which he could not have seemed to be at all, because every one of them is now seen to be an illusion. We accept that other lettered things have been found in mounds in the United States. Of course, we do what we can to make the selection seem not gross and arbitrary and irrational. Then, if we accept that inscribed things of ancient origin have been found in the United States, that cannot be attributed to any race indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, that are not in any language ever heard of in the Eastern Hemisphere. There's nothing to it but to turn non-Euclidean and try to conceive of a third hemisphere, or to accept that there has been intercourse between the Western Hemisphere and some other world. End of Part A of Chapter 11. Read by J.C. Guan, Montreal, November 2008. 11b of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 11, Part B. But there is a peculiarity to these inscribed objects. They remind me of the records left by Sir John Franklin in the Arctic, but also of attempts made by relief expeditions to communicate with the Franklin expedition. The lost explorers cached their records, or concealed them conspicuously in mounds. The relief expeditions sent up balloons, from which messages were dropped broadcast. Our data are of things that have been cached, and of things that seem to have been dropped. Or a lost expedition from somewhere, explorers from somewhere, and their inability to return, then a long, sentimental, persistent attempt, in the spirit of our own Arctic relief expeditions, at least to establish communication. What if it may have succeeded? We think of India, the millions of natives who are ruled by a small band of exoterics, only because they receive support and direction from somewhere else, or from England. In 1838, Mr. A.B. Tomlinson, owner of the great mound at Grave Creek, West Virginia, excavated the mound. He said that, in the presence of witnesses, he had found a small, flat, oval stone, or disc, upon which were engraved alphabetic characters. Colonel Whittlesey, an expert in these matters, says that the stone is now "universally regarded by archaeologists as a fraud," that, in his opinion, Mr. Tomlinson had been imposed upon. Avebury, Prehistoric Times, page 271. I mention it because it has been the subject of much discussion, but it is now generally admitted to be a fraud. It is inscribed with Hebrew characters, but the forger has copied the modern instead of the ancient form of the letters." As I have said, we're as irritable here, under the impression of the anthropologists, as ever were slaves in the South toward superiorities from "poor white trash." When we finally reverse our relative positions, we shall give lowest place to the anthropologists. A Dr. Gray does at least look at a fish before he conceives of a miraculous origin for it. We shall have to submerge Lord Avebury far below him, if we accept that the stone from Grave Creek is generally regarded as a fraud by eminent authorities who did not know it from some other object; or, in general, that so decided an opinion must be the product of either deliberate disregard, or ignorance, or fatigue. The stone belongs to a class of phenomena that is repulsive to the system. It will not assimilate with the system. Let such an object be heard of by such a systematist as Avebury, and the mere mention of it is as nearly certainly the stimulus to a conventional reaction as is a charged body to an electroscope or a glass of beer to a prohibitionist. It is of the ideals of science to know one object from another before expressing an opinion upon a thing, but that is not the spirit of universal mechanics. A thing, it is attractive or repulsive, its conventional reaction follows. Because it is not the stone from Grave Creek that is in Hebrew characters, either ancient or modern, it is a stone from Newark, Ohio, of which the story is told that a forger made this mistake of using modern instead of ancient Hebrew characters. We shall see that the inscription upon the Grave Creek stone is not in Hebrew. Or all things are presumed to be innocent, but are supposed to be guilty unless they assimilate. Colonel Whittlesey, Western Reserve Historical Tracts, No. 33, says that the Grave Creek stone was considered a fraud by Wilson, Squires, and Davis. Then he comes to the Congress of Archaeologists at Nancy, France, 1875. It is hard for Colonel Whittlesey to admit that, at this meeting, which sounds important, the stone was endorsed. He reminds us of Mr. Symons and the man who "considered" that he saw something. Colonel Whittlesey's somewhat tortuous expression is that the finder of the stone "so imposed his views" upon the Congress that it pronounced the stone genuine. Also, the stone was examined by Schoolcraft. He gave his opinion for genuineness. Or, there's only one process, and see-saw is one of its aspects. 3 or 4 fat experts on the side against us. We find 4 or 5 plump ones on our side. Or all that we call logic and reasoning ends up as sheer preponderance or avoirdupois. Then several philologists came out in favor of genuineness. Some of them translated the inscription. Of course, as we have said, it is our method, or the method of orthodoxy, way in which all conclusions are reached, to have some awfully eminent, or preponderantly plump, authorities with us whenever we can. In this case, however, we feel just a little apprehensive in being caught in such excellently obese but somewhat negativized company. Translation by Mr. John Bird. Thy orders are laws. Thou shinest in impetuous élan and rapid chamois. Mr. Maurice Schwab, "The chief of emigration who reached these places, or this island, has fixed these characters forever." Mr. Oppert: "The grave of one who was assassinated here. May God, to revenge him, strike his murderer, cutting off the hand of his existence." I like the first one the best. I have such a vivid impression from it of someone polishing up brass or something, and in an awful hurry. Of course, the third is more dramatic. Still, they're all very good. They are perturbations of one another, I suppose. In Tract 44, Colonel Whittlesey returns to the subject. He gives the conclusion of Major de Helward at the Congress of Luxembourg, 1877. "If Professor Red and myself are right in the conclusion that the figures are neither of the Runic, Phoenician, Canaanite, Hebrew, Libyan, Celtic, or any other alphabet language, its importance has been greatly overrated." Obvious to a child, obvious to any mentality not helplessly subjected to a system. That just therein lies the importance of this object. It is said that an ideal of science is to find out the new. But unless a thing be of the old, it is unimportant. "It is not worth while," Hovey. Then the inscribed axe, or wedge, which, according to Dr. John C. Evans, in a communication to the American Ethnological Society, was plowed up near Pemberton, New Jersey, 1859. The characters upon this axe, or wedge, are strikingly similar to the characters on the Grave Creek stone. Also, with a little disregard here and a little more there, they look like tracks in the snow by someone who's been out celebrating, or like your handwriting, or mine, when we think there's a certain distinction in illegibility. Method of disregard. Anything's anything. Dr. Abbott describes this object in the Report of the Smithsonian Institution, 1875-260. He says he has no faith in it. All progress is from the outrageous to the commonplace, or quasi-existence proceeds from rape to the crooning of lullabies. It's been interesting to me to go over various long-established periodicals and note controversies between attempting positivists and then intermediatistic issues, bold, bad intruders of theories, ruffians with dishonorable intentions, the alarms of science, her attempts to preserve that which is dearer than life itself, submission, then a fidelity like Mrs. Micawber's. So many of these ruffians, or wandering comedians that were hated, or scorned, pitied, embraced, conventionalized. There's not a notion in this book that has a more frightful or ridiculous mien that had the notion of human footprints in rocks, when that now respectabilized ruffian or clown was first heard from. It seems bewildering to one whose interests are not scientific that such rows should be raised over such trifles. But the feeling of a systematist toward such an intruder is just about what anyone's would be if a tramp from the street should come in, sit at one's dinner table, and say he belonged there. We know what hypnosis can do. Let him insist with all his might that he does belong there, and one begins to suspect that he may be right, that he may have higher perceptions of what's right. The prohibitionists have this worked out very skillfully. So the row that was raised over the stone from Grave Creek, but time and cumulativeness, and the very factor we make so much of, or the power of massed data. There were other reports of inscribed stones, and then, half a century later, some mounds, or caches, as we call them, were opened by Reverend Mr. Gass, near the city of Davenport. American Antiquarian, 15-73. Several stone tablets were found, Upon one of them, the letters TFT OWNS may easily be made out. In this instance, we hear nothing of fraudulency. Time, cumulativeness, the power of massed data. The attempt to assimilate this datum is, that the tablet was probably of Mormon origin. Why? Because at Mendon, Illinois, was found a brass plate, upon which were similar characters. Why that? Because that was found "near a house once occupied by a Mormon." In a real existence, a real meteorologist, suspecting that cinders had come from a fire engine, would have asked a fireman. Tablets of Davenport. There's not a record findable that it ever occurred to any antiquarian to ask a Mormon. Other tablets were found. Upon one of them are 2 F's and 2 8's. Also a large tablet, 12 inches by 8 to 10 inches, with Roman numerals and Arabic. It is said that the figure 8 occurs 3 times, and that the figure or letter O 7 times. With these familiar characters are others that resembled ancient alphabets, either Phoenician or Hebrew." It may be that the discovery of Australia, for instance, will turn out to be less important than the discovery and the meaning of these tablets. But where will you read of them in anything subsequently published? What antiquarian has ever since tried to understand them, and their presence, and indications of antiquity, in a land that we're told was inhabited only by unlettered savages? These things that are exhumed only to be buried in some other way. Another tablet was found at Davenport by Mr. Charles Harrison, president of the American Antiquarian Society. "8 and other hieroglyphs are upon this tablet." This time also, fraud is not mentioned. My own notion is that it is very unsportsmanlike ever to mention fraud. Accept anything, then explain it your way. Anything that assimilates with one explanation must have assimilable relations, to some degree, with all other explanations, if all explanations are somewhere continuous. Mormons are lugged in again, but the attempt is faint and helpless, "because general circumstances make it difficult to explain the presence of these tablets." Altogether, our phantom resistance is mere attribution to the Mormons, without the slightest attempt to find base for the attribution. We think of messages that were showered upon this earth, and of messages that were cached in mounds upon this earth. The similarity to the Franklin situation is striking. Conceivably, centuries from now, objects dropped from relief expedition balloons may be found in the Arctic, and conceivably there are still undiscovered caches left by Franklin, in the hope that relief expeditions would find them. It would be as incongruous to attribute these things to the Eskimos as to attribute tablets and lettered stones to the aborigines of America. Some time I shall take up an expression that the queer-shaped mounds upon this earth were built by explorers from somewhere, unable to get back, designed to attract attention from some other world, and that a vast sword-shaped mound had been discovered upon the moon. Just now we think of lettered things and their 2 possible significances. A bizarre little lost soul, rescued from one of the morgues of the American Journal of Science. An account, sent by a correspondent to Professor Silliman, of something that was found in a block of marble, taken November 1829, from a quarry near Philadelphia. American Journal of Science, 1-19-361. The block was cut into slabs. By this process, it is said, was exposed an indentation in the stone, about 1½ inches by 5/8 of an inch, a geometric indentation. In it were two definite-looking raised letters, like I, U. Only difference is that the corners of the U are not rounded, but are straight angles. We are told that this block of stone came from a depth of 70 or 80 feet, or that, if acceptable, this lettering was done long, long ago. To some persons not sated with the commonness of the incredible that has to be accepted, it may seem grotesque to think that an indentation in sand could have tons of other sand piled upon it and hardening into stone, without being pressed out. But the famous Nicaraguan footprints were found in a quarry under 11 strata of solid rock. There was no discussion of this datum. We only take it out for an airing. As to lettered stones that may once upon a time have been showered upon Europe, if we cannot accept that the stones were inscribed by indigenous inhabitants of Europe, many have been found in caves, whence they were carried as curiosities by prehistoric men, or as ornaments, I suppose, about the size and shape of the Grave Creek stone or disk, "flat and oval and about 2 inches wide," Solis. Characters painted upon them, found first by Mr. Piet in the cave of Mas d'Azil, Ariège. According to Solis, they are marked in various directions with red and black lines, "but on not a few of them more complex characters occur, which in a few instances simulate some of the capital letters of the Roman alphabet." In one instance the letters F, E, I, accompanied by no other markings to modify them, are as plain as they could be. According to Solis, Ancient Hunters, page 95, Mr. Cartaillac has confirmed the observations of Piet, and Mr. Boulle has found additional examples. "They offer one of the darkest problems of prehistoric times." Solis. As to caches in general, I should say that they are made with two purposes: to proclaim and to conceal; or that caches in documents are hidden, or covered over, in conspicuous structures. At least, so are designed the cairns in the Arctic. Transcripts of the New York Academy of Sciences, 11-27. That Mr. J.H. Hooper, Bradley County, Tennessee, having come upon a curious stone in some woods upon his farm, investigated. He dug. He unearthed a long wall. Upon this wall were inscribed many alphabetic characters. 872 characters have been examined, many of them duplicates, and a few imitations of animal forms, the moon, and other objects. Accidental imitations of Oriental alphabets are numerous." The part that seems significant: that these letters had been hidden under a layer of cement. And still, in our own heterogeneity, or unwillingness, or inability to concentrate upon single concepts, we shall, or we shan't, accept that though there may have been a lost colony or lost expedition from somewhere upon this earth, and extra-mundane visitors who could never get back, there have been other extra-mundane visitors who have gone away again, altogether quite in analogy with the Franklin expedition and Peary flittings in the Arctic, and a wreck that occurred to one group of them, and the loot that was lost overboard. The Chinese seals of Ireland. Not the things with the big wistful eyes that lie on ice, and that are taught to balance objects on their noses, but inscribed stamps with which to make impressions. Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy, 1-381. A paper was read by Mr. J. Huband Smith, descriptive of about a dozen Chinese seals that have been found in Ireland. They are all alike, each a cube with an animal seated upon it. "It is said that the inscriptions upon them are of a very ancient class of Chinese characters." End quote. The 3 points that have made a leper and an outcast of this datum, but only in the sense of disregard, because nowhere that I know of is it questioned. Agreement among archaeologists is that there were no relations, in the remote past, between China and Ireland. That no other objects from ancient China, virtually I suppose, have ever been found in Ireland. The great distance at which these seals have been found apart. After Mr. Smith's investigations, if he did investigate, or do more than record, many more Chinese seals were found in Ireland, and, with one exception, only in Ireland. In 1852 about 60 had been found. Of all archaeologic finds in Ireland, "none is enveloped in greater mystery." Chambers' Journal, 16-364. According to the writer in Chambers' Journal, one of these seals was found in a curiosity shop in London. When questioned, the shopkeeper said that it had come from Ireland. In this instance, if you don't take instinctively to our expression, there is no orthodox explanation for your preference. It is the astonishing scattering of them, over field and forest, that has hushed the explainers. In the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy, 10-171, Dr. Fraser says that they "appear to have been sown broadcast over the county in some strange way that I cannot offer a solution of." The struggle for expression of a notion that did not belong to Dr. Fraser's era. "The invariable story of their find is what we might expect if they had been accidentally dropped." 3 were found in Tipperary, 6 in Cork, 3 in Down, 4 in Waterford, all of the rest 1 or 2 to a county. But one of these Chinese seals was found in the bed of the river Boyne, near Colnard, Meath, when workmen were raising gravel. That one, at least, had been dropped there. End of Chapter 11. Read by J.C. Guan, Montreal, November 2008.
Chapter 12 of The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 12. Astronomy, and a watchman looking at half a dozen lanterns where a street's been torn up. There are gas lights and kerosene lamps and electric lights in the neighborhood, matches flaring, fires in stoves, bonfires, house afire somewhere, lights of automobiles, illuminated signs, the watchman and his one little system, ethics, and some young ladies and the dear old professor of a very select seminary. Drugs and divorce and rape, venereal diseases, drunkenness, murder, excluded. The prim and the precise, or the exact, the homogeneous, the single, the puritanic, the mathematic, the pure, the perfect. We can have illusion of this state, but only by disregarding its infinite denials. It's a drop of milk afloat in acid that's eating it. The positive swamped by the negative. So it is in intermediateness, where only to be positive is to generate corresponding and, perhaps, equal negativeness. In our acceptance, it is, in quasi-existence, premonitory, or prenatal, or pre-awakening consciousness of a real existence. But this consciousness of realness is the greatest resistance to efforts to realize or to become real, because it is feeling that realness has been attained. Our antagonism is not to science, but to the attitude of the sciences that they have finally realized, or to belief instead of acceptance to the insufficiency, which, as we have seen over and over, amounts to paltriness and puerility of scientific dogmas and standards. Or if several persons start out to Chicago and get to Buffalo, and one be under the delusion that Buffalo is Chicago, that one will be a resistance to the progress of the others. So astronomy and its seemingly exact little system. But data we shall have of round worlds and spindle-shaped worlds and worlds shaped like a wheel, worlds like titanic pruning hooks, worlds linked together by streaming filaments, solitary worlds and worlds in hordes, tremendous worlds and tiny worlds, some of them made of material like the material of this earth, and worlds that are geometric, superconstructions made of iron and steel. Or not only fall from the sky of ashes and cinders and coke and charcoal and oily substances that suggest fuel, but the masses of iron that have fallen upon this earth. Wrecks and flotsam and fragments of vast iron constructions. Or steel. Sooner or later we shall have to take up an expression that fragments of steel have fallen from the sky. If fragments not of iron, but of steel have fallen upon this earth. But what would a deep-sea fish learn, even if a steel plate of a wrecked vessel above him should drop and bump him on the nose? Our submergence in a sea of conventionality, of almost impenetrable density. Sometimes I'm a savage who has found something on the beach of his island. Sometimes I'm a deep-sea fish with a sore nose. The greatest of mysteries. Why don't they ever come here or send here openly? Of course, there's nothing to that mystery if we don't take so seriously the notion that we must be interesting. It's probably for moral reasons that they stay away. But even so, there must be some degraded ones among them. Or physical reasons. When we can specially take up that subject, one of our leading ideas, or credulities, will be that near approach by another world to this world would be catastrophic, that navigable worlds would avoid proximity, that others that have survived have organized into protective remotenesses, or orbits which approximate to regularity, though by no means to the degree of popular supposition. But the persistence of the notion that we must be interesting, bugs and germs and things like that, they're interesting to us. Some of them are too interesting. Dangers of near approach. Nevertheless, our own ships that dare not venture close to a rocky shore can send rowboats ashore. Why not diplomatic relations established between the United States and Cyclorea, which in our advanced astronomy is the name of a remarkable wheel-shaped world or superconstruction? Why not missionaries sent here openly to convert us from our barbarous prohibitions and other taboos, and to prepare the way for a good trade in ultra-Bibles and super-whiskeys, fortunes made in selling us cast-off super-fineries, which we'd take to like an African chief to someone's old silk hat from New York or London? The answer that occurs to me is so simple that it seems immediately acceptable, if we accept that the obvious is the solution of all problems, or if most of our perplexities consist in laboriously and painfully conceiving of the unanswerable, and then looking for answers, using such words as obvious and solution conventionally. Or would we, if we could, educate and sophisticate pigs, geese, cattle? Would it be wise to establish diplomatic relations with the hen that now functions, satisfied with mere sense of achievement by way of compensation? I think we're property. I should say we belong to something. that once upon a time this earth was no man's land, that other worlds explored and colonized here and fought among themselves for possessions, but that now it's owned by something. That something owns this earth, all others warned off. Nothing in our own times, perhaps, because I am thinking of certain notes I have, has ever appeared upon this earth from somewhere else, so openly as Columbus landed upon San Salvador, or as Hudson sailed up his river. But as to surreptitious visits to this earth in recent times, or as to emissaries, perhaps from other worlds, or voyagers who have shown every indication of intent to evade and avoid, we shall have data as convincing as our data of oil or coal burning aerial superconstructions. But in this vast subject I shall have to do considerable neglecting or disregarding myself. I don't see how I can, in this book, take up at all the subject of possible use of humanity to some other mode of existence, or the flattering notion that we can possibly be worth something. Pigs, geese, and cattle. First find out that they are owned. Then find out the whyness of it. I suspect that, after all, we're useful, that among contesting claimants, adjustment has occurred, or that something now has a legal right to us, by force, or by having paid out analogues of beads for us to former, more primitive owners of us, all others warned off, that all this has been known, perhaps for ages, to certain ones upon this earth, a cult or order, members of which function like bellwethers to the rest of us, or as superior slaves or overseers, directing us in accordance with instructions received from somewhere else in our mysterious usefulness. But I accept that, in the past, before proprietorship was established, inhabitants of a host of other worlds have dropped here, hopped here, wafted, sailed, flown, motored, walked here, for all I know, been pulled here, been pushed, have come singly, have come in enormous numbers, have visited occasionally, have visited periodically for hunting, trading, replenishing harems, mining, have been unable to stay here, have established colonies here, have been lost here, far advanced peoples, or things, and primitive peoples, or whatever they were, white ones, black ones, yellow ones. I have a very convincing datum that the ancient Britons were the blue ones. Of course, we are told by conventional anthropologists that they only painted themselves blue, but in our own advanced anthropology, they were veritable blue ones. Annals of Philosophy, 1451. Note of a blue child born in England. That's atavism. Giants and fairies. We accept them, of course, or if we pride ourselves upon being awfully far advanced, I don't know how to sustain our conceit except by very largely going far back. Science of today, the superstition of tomorrow. Science of tomorrow, the superstition of today. Notice of a stone axe, 17 inches long, 9 inches across, broad end. Proceedings, Society of Antiquities of Scotland, 19184. American Antiquarian, 1860. Copper axe from an Ohio mound, 22 inches long, weight 38 pounds. American Anthropologist, NS 8229. Stone axe found at Birchwood, Wisconsin, exhibited in the collection of the Missouri Historical Society, found with the pointed end embedded in the soil, for all I know, may have dropped there, 28 inches long, 14 wide, 11 thick, weight 300 pounds. Or the footprints in sandstone near Carson, Nevada, each print 18 to 20 inches long. American Journal of Science, 3/26/139. These footprints are very clear and well-defined reproduction of them in the journal, but they assimilate with the system, like sour apples, to other systems. So Professor Marsh, a loyal and unscrupulous systematist, argues, quote, "The size of these footprints, and specially the width between the right and left series, are strong evidence that they were not made by men, as has been so generally supposed." End quote. So these excluders, stranglers of Minerva, desperados of disregard, above all, or below all, the anthropologists. I'm inspired with a new insult. Someone offends me. I wish to express almost absolute contempt for him. He's a systematistic anthropologist. Simply to read something of this kind is not so impressive as to see for one's self, if anyone will take the trouble to look up these footprints as pictured in the journal. He will either agree with Professor Marsh, or feel that to deny them is to indicate a mind as profoundly enslaved by a system as was ever the humble intellect of a medieval monk. The reasoning of this representative phantom of the chosen, or of the special appearances who sit in judgment or condemnation upon us of the more nearly real. That there never were giants upon this earth, because gigantic footprints are more gigantic than prints made by men who are not giants. We think of giants as occasional visitors to this earth. Of course, Stonehenge, for instance. It may be that, as time goes on, we shall have to admit that there are remains of many tremendous habitations of giants upon this earth, and that their appearances here were more than casual, but their bones, or the absence of their bones, except that no matter how cheerful and unsuspicious my disposition may be, when I go to the American Museum of Natural History, dark cynicisms arise the moment I come to the fossils, or old bones that have been found upon this earth, gigantic things, that have been reconstructed into terrifying but proper dinosaurs. But my uncheerfulness. The dodo did it. On one of the floors below the fossils they have a reconstructed dodo. It's frankly a fiction, it's labeled as such, but it's been reconstructed so cleverly and so convincingly. Fairies. Fairy crosses. Harper's Weekly, 50/7/15. That, near the point where the Blue Ridge and the Allegheny Mountains unite, north of Patrick County, Virginia, many little stone crosses have been found. A race of tiny beings. They crucified cockroaches. Exquisite beings, but the cruelty of the exquisite. In their diminutive way, they were human beings. They crucified. The fairy crosses, we are told in Harper's Weekly, range in weight from 1/4 of an ounce to an ounce, but it is said in the Scientific American that some of them are no larger than the head of a pin. They've been found in 2 other states, but all in Virginia are strictly localized on and along Bull Mountain. We are reminded of the Chinese seals in Ireland. I suppose they fell there. Some are Roman crosses, some St. Andrew's, some Maltese. This time we are spared contact with the anthropologists and have geologists instead. But I am afraid that the relief to our finer or more nearly real sensibilities will not be very great. The geologists were called upon to explain the fairy crosses. Their response was the usual scientific tropism. Geologists say that they are crystals. The writer in Harper's Weekly points out that this holds up, or this anesthetic, if theoretic science be little but attempt to assuage pangs of the unexplained, fails to account for the localized distributions of these objects, which makes me think of both aggregation and separation at the bottom of the sea, if from a wrecked ship similar objects should fall in large numbers, but at different times. But some are Roman crosses, some St. Andrews, some Maltese. Conceivably, there might be a mineral that would have a diversity of geometric forms, at the same time restricted to some expression of the cross, because snowflakes, for instance, have diversity but restriction to the hexagon. But the guilty geologists, cold-blooded as astronomers and chemists and all the other deep-sea fishes, though less profoundly of the pseudo-saved than the wretched anthropologists, disregarded the very datum that it was wise to disregard: that the fairy crosses are not all made of the same material. It's the same old disregard, or it's the same old psychotropism, or process of assimilation. Crystals are geometric forms. Crystals are included in the system. So then fairy crosses are crystals, but that different minerals should, in a few different regions, be inspired to turn into different forms of the cross, is the kind of resistance that we call less nearly real than our own acceptances. We now come to some cursed little things that are of the lost, but for the salvation of which scientific missionaries have done their damnedest. Pygmy flints. They can't very well be denied. They're lost and well known. Pygmy flints are tiny prehistoric implements. Some of them are 1/4 of an inch in size. England, India, France, South Africa, they've been found in many parts of the world, whether showered there or not. They belong high up in the froth of the accursed. They are not denied, and they've not been disregarded. There's an abundant literature upon this subject. One attempt to rationalize them, or assimilate them, or take them into the scientific fold, has been the notion that they were toys of prehistoric children. It sounds reasonable, but, of course, by the reasonable, we mean that for which the equally reasonable, but opposing, has not been found out, except that we modify that by saying that, though nothing's finally reasonable, some phenomena have higher approximations to reasonableness than have others. Against the notion of toys, the higher approximation is that where pygmy flints are found, all flints are pygmies, at least so in India, where, when larger implements have been found in the same place, there are separations by strata. Wilson. The datum that, just at present, leads me to accept that these flints were made by beings about the size of pickles is a point brought about by Professor Wilson. This is in the report of the National Museum, 1892, 455. Not only that the flints are tiny, but that the chipping upon them is minute. Struggle for expression, in the mind of a 19th centuryite, of an idea that did not belong to his era. In Science Gossip, 1896, 36, R.A. Galty says, "So fine is the chipping that to see the workmanship a magnifying glass is necessary." End quote. I think that would be absolutely convincing if there were anything, absolutely anything, either that tiny beings from pickle to cucumber stature made these things, or that ordinary savages made them under magnifying glasses. The idea that we are now going to develop, or perpetrate, is rather intensely of the accursed, or the advanced. It's a lost soul, I admit, or boast, but it fits in. Or, as conventional as ever, our own method is the scientific method of assimilating. It assimilates if we think of the inhabitants of Elvera. By the way, I forgot to tell the name of the giant's world. Monstrator. Spindle-shaped world, about 100,000 miles along its major axis. More details to be published later. But our coming inspiration fits in if we think of the inhabitants of Elvera as having only visited here, having, in hordes as dense as clouds of bats, come here upon hunting excursions. For mice, I should say, for bees very likely, or most likely of all, or inevitably, to convert the heathen here, horrified with anyone who would gorge himself with more than a bean at a time, fearful for the souls of beings who would guzzle more than a dewdrop at a time, hordes of tiny missionaries determined that right should prevail, determining right by their own minutenesses. They must have been missionaries. Only to be is motion, to convert or assimilate something else. The idea now is that tiny creatures, coming here from their own little world, which may be Eros, though I call it Elvera, would flit from the exquisite to the enormous, gulp of a fair-sized terrestrial animal, half a dozen of them gone and soon digested. One falls into a brook, torn away in a mighty torrent. Or never anything but conventional we adopt from Darwin. Quote, the geological records are incomplete, end quote. Their flints would survive, but as to their fragile bodies, one might as well search for prehistoric frost traceries. A little whirlwind, Elverian, carried away 100 yards, body never found by his companions. They'd mourn for the departed, conventional emotion to have, they'd mourn. There'd have to be a funeral. There's no getting away from funerals. So I adopt an explanation that I take from the anthropologists. Burial in effigy. Perhaps the Elverians would not come to this earth again until many years later. Another distressing occurrence. One little mausoleum for all burials in effigy. London Times, July 20th, 1836. That, early in July 1836, some boys were searching for rabbits' burrows in the rocky formations near Edinburgh, known as Arthur's Seat. In the side of a cliff, they came upon some thin sheets of slate, which they pulled out. Little cave. 17 tiny coffins. 3 or 4 inches long. In the coffins were miniature wooden figures. They were dressed differently, both in style and material. There were 2 tiers of 8 coffins each, and a 3rd tier begun, with 1 coffin. The extraordinary datum, which has especially made mystery here, that the coffins had been deposited singly in the little cave, and at intervals of many years. In the first tier, the coffins were quite decayed, and the wrappings had mouldered away. In the second tier, the effects of age had not advanced so far, and the top coffin was quite recent-looking. In the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquarians of Scotland, 3/12/460, there is a full account of this find. 3 of the coffins and 3 of the figures are pictured. So Elvera, with its downy forests and its microscopic oyster shells, and if the Elverians be not very far advanced, they take baths with sponges the size of pinheads, or that catastrophes have occurred, that fragments of Elvera have fallen to this earth. In Popular Science, 2083, Francis Bingham writing of the corals and sponges and shells and crinoids that Dr. Hahn had asserted that he had found in meteorites, says, judging by the photographs of them, that their notable peculiarity is their extreme smallness. The corals, for instance, are about 1/20th the size of terrestrial corals. They represent a veritable pygmy animal world, says Bingham. The inhabitants of Monstrator and Elvera were primitives, I think, at the time of their occasional visits to this earth, though, of course, in a quasi-existence, anything that we semi-phantoms call evidence of anything may be just as good evidence of anything else. Logicians and detectives and jurymen and suspicious wives and members of the Royal Astronomic Society recognize this indeterminateness, but have the delusion that in the method of agreement there is final or real evidence. The method is good enough for an existence that is only semi-real, but also it is the method of reasoning by which witches were burned, and by which ghosts have been feared. I'd not like to be so unadvanced as to deny witches and ghosts, but I do think that there never have been witches and ghosts like those of popular supposition. But stories of them have been supported by astonishing fabrications of details and of different accounts in agreement. So, if a giant left impressions of his bare feet in the ground, that is not to say that he was a primitive, bulk of culture out taking the Knipe cure. So if Stonehenge is a large but only roughly geometric construction, the inattention to details by its builders signifies anything you please, ambitious dwarfs or giants, if giants, that they were little more than cavemen, or they were post-impressionist architects from a very far advanced civilization. If there are other worlds, there are tutelary worlds, or that Kepler, for instance, could not have been absolutely wrong, that his notion of an angel assigned to push along and guide each planet may not be very acceptable, but that abstractedly, or in the notion of a tutelary relation, we may find acceptance. Only to be is to be tutelary. Our general expression that everything in intermediateness is not a thing, but is an endeavor to become something, by breaking away from its continuity, or merging away with all other phenomena, is an attempt to break away from the very essence of a relative existence, and become absolute, if it have not surrendered to, or become part of, some higher attempt. That to this process there are two aspects: attraction, or the spirit of everything to assimilate all other things, if it have not given in and subordinated to, or have not been assimilated by, some higher attempted system, unity, organization, entity, harmony, equilibrium. And repulsion, or the attempt of everything to exclude or disregard the unassimilable. Universality of the process. Anything conceivable. A tree, it is doing all it can to assimilate substances of the soil and substances of the air, and sunshine too, into tree substance. Obversely, it is rejecting or excluding or disregarding that which it cannot assimilate. Cow grazing, pig roosting, tiger stalking, planets trying or acting to capture comets, rag pickers and the Christian religion, and a cat down headfirst in a garbage can, nations fighting for more territory, sciences correlating the data they can, trust magnates organizing, chorus girl out for a little late supper. All of them stopped somewhere by the unassimilable. Chorused girl in the broiled lobster, if she eats not shell, and all she represents, universal failure to positivize. Also, if she does, she represents universal failure to positivize her ensuing disorders, will translate her to the negative absolute. Or science and some of our cursed hard-shelled data. One speaks of the tutelarian as if it were something distinct in itself. So one speaks of a tree, a saint, a barrel of pork, the Rocky Mountains. One speaks of missionaries as if they were positively different, or had identity of their own, or were a species by themselves. To the intermediatist, everything that seems to have identity is only attempted identity, and every species is continuous with all other species, or that which is called the specific is only emphasis upon some aspect of the general. If there are cats, their only emphasis upon universal felinity. There is nothing that does not partake of that of which the missionary or the tutelary is the special. Every conversation is a conflict of missionaries, each trying to convert the other, to assimilate, or to make the other similar to himself. If no progress be made, mutual repulsion will follow. If other worlds have ever in the past had relations with this earth, they were attempted positivizations to extend themselves by colonies upon this earth to convert or assimilate indigenous inhabitants of this earth, or parent worlds and their colonies here. Super-Romanimus, or where the first Romans came from. It's as good as the Romulus and Remus story. Super-Israelimus, or that, despite modern reasoning upon this subject, there was once something that was super-parental or tutelary to early Orientals. Azuria, which was tutelary to the early Britons. Azuria, whence came the blue Britons, whose descendants gradually diluting, like bluing, in a washtub where a faucet's turned on, have been most emphasized of sub-tutelarians, or assimilations, ever since. Worlds that were once tutelarian worlds, before this earth became sole property of one of them, their attempts to convert or assimilate, but then the state that comes to all things in their missionary frustrations, unacceptance by all stomachs of some things, rejection by all societies of some units, glaciers that sort over and cast out stones, repulsion, wrath of the baffled missionary. There is no other wrath. All repulsion is reaction to the unassimilable. So then the wrath of Azuria, because surrounding peoples of this earth would not assimilate with her own colonists in the part of the earth that we now call England. I don't know that there has ever been more nearly just, reasonable, or logical wrath in this earth's history, if there is no other wrath. The wrath of Azuria, because the other peoples of this earth would not turn blue to suit her. History is a department of human delusion that interests us. We are able to give a little advancement to history. In the vitrified forts of a few parts of Europe, we find data that the Humes and Gibbons have disregarded. The vitrified forts surrounding England, but not in England. The vitrified forts of Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Bohemia. or that once upon a time, with electric blasts, Azuria tried to swipe the earth clear of the peoples who resisted her. The vast blue bulk of Azuria appeared in the sky. Clouds turned green. The sun was formless and purple in the vibrations of wrath that were emanating from Azuria. The whitish or yellowish or brownish peoples of Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Bohemia fled to hilltops and built forts. In a real existence, hilltops, or easiest accessibility to an aerial enemy, would be the last choice in refuges. But here, in quasi-existence, if we're accustomed to run to hilltops in times of danger, we run to them just the same, even with danger closest to hilltops. Very common in quasi-existence, attempt to escape by running closer to the pursuing. They built forts, or already had forts, on hilltops. Something poured electricity upon them. The stones of these forts exist to this day, vitrified, or melted and turned to glass. The archaeologists have jumped from one conclusion to another, like the rapid chamois we read of a while ago, to account for vitrified forts, always restricted by the commandment that unless their conclusions conformed to such tenets as exclusionism of the system, they would be excommunicated. So archaeologists, in their medieval dread of excommunication, have tried to explain vitrified forts in terms of terrestrial experience. We find in their insufficiencies the same old assimilating of all that could be assimilated, and disregard for the unassimilable, conventionalizing into the explanation that vitrified forts were made by prehistoric peoples who built vast fires, often remote from wood supply, to melt externally and to cement together the stones of their constructions. But negativeness always, so within itself, a science can never be homogeneous or unified or harmonious. So Miss Russell, in the Journal of the BAA, has pointed out that it is seldom that single stones, to say nothing of long walls of large houses that are burned to the ground, are vitrified. If we pay a little attention to this subject ourselves before starting to write upon it, which is one of the ways of being more nearly real than oppositions so far encountered by us, we find that the stones of these forts are vitrified in no reference to cementing them. They are cemented here and there in streaks, as if special blasts had struck or played upon them. Then one thinks of lightning? Once upon a time, something melted in streaks the stones of forts on the tops of hills in Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Bohemia. Lightning selects the isolated and conspicuous. But some of the vitrified forts are not on top of hills. Some are very inconspicuous. Their walls, too, are vitrified in streaks. Something once had effect similar to lightning upon forts, mostly on hills in Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Bohemia. But upon hills all over the rest of the world are remains of forts that are not vitrified. There is only one crime in the local sense, and that is not to turn blue, if the gods are blue. But in the universal sense, the one crime is not to turn the gods themselves green, if you're green. End of chapter 12. Recording by Patrick McAfee, Chicago, gis.depaul.edu/P. McAfee.